My lawyer husband cheated and stole $80K from our son's trust. But when I came home early, what I saw destroyed me. My 6-year-old called me by my name, and she was living in my bed. I'm 32 years old. I'm a pediatric nurse. And what happened 6 months ago literally destroyed the world I thought I had. I've been married to Christopher for 8 years. Well, technically, I'm still married to him, but that's about to change. And we have a 6-year-old son named Noah. Christopher is a corporate lawyer, or was. I'll get to that part. And I guess from the outside, we looked like the perfect family. You know, nice house in a good neighborhood, 2 professionals with good jobs, a healthy kid. But the truth is, things had been weird for months, maybe even a year. And I attributed it to work stress, to Christopher working on big cases, to me having crazy shifts at the hospital. Looking back, I should have seen it coming. All the signs were there. But I guess when you trust someone completely, when you've built an entire life with that person, you just don't want to see what's right in front of your eyes. Everything started getting really weird like 6 months before the final disaster. Christopher started mentioning a work colleague a lot. Victoria? It was always Victoria this, Victoria that. Victoria has a brilliant idea for the case. Victoria and I stayed late working. At first, I didn't think much of it. I mean, I work with a bunch of doctors and nurses, and I talk about them at home all the time. It's normal, right? But then he started coming home later and later, and when I'd ask him what he had for dinner, he'd say he ordered takeout with Victoria, that they'd worked at the office until 11 at night. On weekends, he started going to the office too, which he never did before, and when I'd suggest we spend family time together, he'd say this case was very important for his career, that if he won it, they'd consider him for partner. I was working 12-hour shifts in pediatrics. Sometimes I had to do weekend on-call, and honestly, I was so tired all the time that I didn't have energy to fight or investigate further. Noah was in 1st grade. We had a usual routine with school and activities, and I just assumed Christopher was being a good dad when I wasn't there. You know, taking him to the park, making him dinner, helping him with homework. The thing is that, 3 months before everything exploded, I started noticing things around the house. Small things that didn't make sense. Like I found a shampoo in our shower that wasn't mine. An expensive shampoo from a brand I would never buy because I work at a hospital and don't have time for those luxury things. When I asked Christopher about it, he said maybe he bought it by mistake, that he thought it was mine. Okay. Weird, but possible. Then I found a women's sweater in the guest room closet. A really nice gray sweater that definitely wasn't mine because I wear size M, and this was size S. Christopher told me it was probably his sister's, that she had come to visit us months ago, but I knew his sister hadn't been to our house in over a year. I started feeling this discomfort in my tensive stomach, this feeling that something was wrong, but I didn't have concrete proof of anything, and I also didn't want to be that paranoid, jealous wife who accuses her husband without reason. Then, 2 months before the big disaster, I had an unexpected day off because they canceled my shift due to lack of patients, which almost never happens, but anyway, and I decided to clean Christopher's home office because he always had it a mess with papers everywhere. I was organizing documents when I found a folder that said personal investments, and, I don't know, something made me open it. Inside were account statements from a family trust that Christopher's mom, Eleanor, had established for him years ago when his dad died. I knew that trust existed, but Christopher had always told me it was untouchable, that it was saved for Noah's college and for our retirement. But these account statements showed large withdrawals, like $50,000, $30,000, in the last 6 months, and there were handwritten notes from Christopher that said things like initial deposit Riverside property and kitchen remodel Victoria. I sat there in his chair looking at those papers, and it felt like the floor was moving under my feet. What property? What remodel? Why was he spending money from the family trust on something related to Victoria? I did what I think anyone would do in that situation. I started looking for more. I checked his computer, the one he left at home, and found his email open because apparently he trusted me so much he didn't even bother logging out. And there they were, hundreds of emails between him and Victoria. Emails that started being professional but quickly became personal, then flirty, then completely inappropriate. Emails where they planned lunches that clearly weren't just lunches. Emails where Christopher told Victoria that I didn't understand him, that our marriage had been dead for years, that he was just waiting for the right moment to leave it. This hit me like a truck, because I thought our marriage was fine. I mean, not perfect, but what marriage is. especially with a young kid and two demanding jobs. There were emails where they discussed buying property together, where Christopher told her he'd found the perfect house for them, that he'd use the trust money for the down payment, and that eventually he'd tell me everything and move in with her. I didn't confront Christopher immediately, and I know I should have, but I was in complete shock. I printed all the emails, photographed all the trust account statements, saved everything in a folder I hid in my car. I kept going to work, kept being Noah's mom, kept acting like everything was normal while inside I was completely falling apart. Christopher didn't notice anything different, or if he noticed he didn't say anything. He kept coming home late, kept talking about Victoria like she was his most important colleague. I started seeing a therapist in secret. I needed to talk to someone who wasn't family or friends, someone who could help me process what was happening and decide what to do. My therapist suggested I consult with a divorce attorney before confronting Christopher, that I document everything, that I protect my financial interests, and especially Noah's. I hired a lawyer, an amazing woman who specializes in complicated divorce cases, and I showed her everything I'd found. She told me this was serious, that the misuse of the family trust could be illegal depending on how the trust was structured, that the emails showed not only infidelity but also that Christopher was planning to leave me and had apparently been preparing this move for months. She suggested I wait for the right moment to confront him, that I gather more evidence, that I make sure I had everything in order before making any move. I followed her advice. As difficult as it was, I kept acting normal. I kept sleeping in the same bed as Christopher, even though it disgusted me to touch him. I kept making dinners and asking him how his day was, while he lied to my face over and over and over again. Then, we get to the weekend that changed everything. It was a weekend in March, I think. Or maybe early April. I'm not exactly sure, but I know it was still cold. I had a double shift scheduled for Saturday and Sunday at the hospital because one of my colleagues was sick and they needed to cover her shift. So, basically, I was going to be away from home from 6 in the morning Saturday until 9 at night, Sunday. Christopher told me no problem, that he'd take care of Noah all weekend, that they'd go to the park and maybe to the movies. I left for work Saturday morning, having no idea what was about to happen. I worked my normal Saturday shift, 12 hours taking care of sick children, which is a job I love, but that's also physically and emotionally exhausting. And then I stayed to sleep in the hospital break room, because my next shift started at 6 in the morning, Sunday. And it didn't make sense to drive home just to sleep 4 hours. Sunday, I worked my full shift. But around 5 in the afternoon, we had a medical emergency that resolved faster than expected, and my supervisor told me to go home early, that they'd already covered the rest of my shift with another nurse. I was so tired I didn't even call Christopher to let him know I was coming home early. I just wanted to get home, take a long shower, and maybe eat something that wasn't hospital food. I drove home, got there around 6 in the evening instead of 9, which was when Christopher was expecting me, and when I opened the front door, everything looked normal at first. The lights were on. I could hear the TV in the living room. It smelled like food, like someone had cooked recently. I walked into the kitchen, and there she was, Victoria, in my kitchen, wearing my apron, the apron with flowers that my mom gave me years ago. She was taking something out of the oven, like it was her house, like she had every right to be there. She saw me and froze, with the oven mitts on and an expression on her face that was half surprise, half something else. Guilt, maybe? I couldn't speak. Literally no words could come out of my mouth. I just stood there in the entrance of my own kitchen, staring at this woman who'd been having an affair with my husband and who was now in my house wearing my apron. She said something like, "Oh, Lauren, we weren't expecting you until later," like it was completely normal for her to be there. Like I was the one arriving unannounced at her house and not the other way around. Before I could process what was happening or say something, I heard Noah running down the stairs yelling, "Mommy's home!" And my heart filled with relief for a second because at least my son was okay. At least he was going to run into my arms like he always did when I came back from work. But when Noah entered the kitchen, he ran right past me, looked at me for a second, and went straight to Victoria. He grabbed onto her leg and said, and I swear these words are engraved in my brain forever. He said, "Mommy, is dinner ready? I'm hungry." I felt like I'd been hit in the stomach with a baseball bat. My son, my 6-year-old baby that I carried for 9 months and gave birth to and breastfed and raised and loved with every fiber of my being, was calling mommy to the woman my husband was cheating on me with. Victoria told Noah something like, "Almost ready, sweetie," and then looked at me with an expression I can't describe. It wasn't regret or shame. It was more like discomfort that I'd ruined their little family fantasy. I finally found my voice, and all I could say was, "What's going on here?" And at that moment, Christopher walked into the kitchen. He looked uncomfortable but not surprised, like he'd known I'd eventually find out but hadn't expected it to be at that exact moment. He tried to explain, said something about Victoria having an emergency with her apartment, that a pipe had broken or something and there was flooding, and that he'd offered to let her stay with us temporarily until they fixed her place, and I just stood there thinking, is he serious? Does he think I'm so stupid I'm going to believe that story? I asked him how long Victoria had been temporarily staying in our house, and Christopher said, only since Friday. But the way he said it, the way he avoided my gaze, made me realize it had probably been longer. I asked him why Noah was calling her mommy, and he started stammering something about Noah being confused, that Victoria had been helping take care of him, and it was just a phase, that kids sometimes say weird things. But I looked at Noah, and he was holding on to Victoria like she was his lifeline, like I was the stranger in this situation, and I knew this had been going on longer than Christopher was admitting, that they'd been manipulating my son, alienating him from me while I worked double shifts at the hospital, saving other children's lives. I didn't stay to hear more. I ran upstairs to our room. Well, what had been our room, and started packing a suitcase with my clothes and my personal things. Christopher followed me up the stairs, saying, "Lauren, wait, we can talk about this. It's not what it looks like." And I turned around and screamed at him. Probably the first time I'd screamed at him in the 8 years we'd been married. I screamed that I knew everything about the affair, about the trust money, about the property they'd bought together, about all the emails. The expression on his face changed from defensive to pure panic. He realized I'd been investigating, that I had evidence of everything. He tried to change his tactic, said he'd explain everything, that it had been a mistake, that he loved our family, but I couldn't listen to him anymore. I couldn't be in that house one more second. I went downstairs with my suitcase, walked into the kitchen where Victoria and Noah were sitting at the table, apparently about to have dinner like a happy family, and I told Noah to pack a backpack with his clothes and his favorite toys because we were going to stay with Grandma Eleanor for a few days. Noah started crying and said he didn't want to leave, that he wanted to stay with Mommy, referring to Victoria, which broke my heart. And Victoria had the audacity to tell me that maybe I should let Noah decide where he wanted to be. I looked her straight in the eyes and told her, with all the calm I could muster, "You're a lawyer. You should know that what you're doing is called parental alienation and it's illegal, and I'm going to use this in court." Her face went white. She finally seemed to understand this wasn't a game, that there were real consequences for what she'd done. Christopher tried to stop me from taking Noah, said I couldn't just take him, that he was his father too. But I reminded him I had documentation of everything, that any judge would see what he'd done and give me custody without thinking twice. I packed Noah's things while he cried, which was the hardest thing I've done in my life. I literally had to carry him to the car while he screamed that he wanted to stay with Christopher and Victoria. And each scream was like a knife in my chest, because I knew my son had been manipulated, that they'd brainwashed him to reject me, his real mother. I drove to Eleanor's house, who lives like 40 minutes from our house, and the whole way Noah cried and asked me why I was taking him away from his real mommy. I tried to explain that I was his real mommy, that I'd carried him in my belly, that I'd been there since the day he was born, but he was 6 years old and confused, and clearly they'd put things in his head. When we got to Eleanor's house, she opened the door and immediately knew something terrible had happened. I explained the whole situation to her, while Noah fell asleep on the living room couch, exhausted from crying so much. Eleanor was furious. She couldn't believe her son had done something like this, that he'd betrayed his family this way, that he'd manipulated his own son. Turns out Eleanor is the administrator of the family trust, because she was the one who established it with her husband's life insurance money when he died. When I told her about the money Christopher had been withdrawing and using to buy property with Victoria, she was livid. She told me that was a direct violation of the trust terms, that the money was designated specifically for education, health, and retirement, not for buying properties with mistresses. The next day, Monday morning, Eleanor called the trust administrators, which is basically a bank that handles this kind of thing, and reported the violations. She sent them all the documentation I'd gathered, the account statements with the withdrawals, Christopher's notes about the property, everything. The bank acted fast, They froze the trust immediately and began a formal investigation. Christopher called Eleanor that same day, yelling at her, saying she was ruining his life, that she had no right to get involved in his finances. Eleanor told him very calmly that he'd ruined his own life when he decided to steal money from a family trust and cheat on his wife, and that as trust administrator she had every right and obligation to report misuse of funds. Christopher tried to call me too, like 50 times that day, but I didn't answer any calls. My lawyer had advised me not to speak with him directly, that all communication should be through lawyers. That same week, my lawyer filed an emergency custody petition and divorce petition. The custody petition cited parental alienation, the fact that Christopher had allowed and even encouraged another woman to act as our son's mother without my consent or knowledge, and that he'd been using family funds illegally. We asked for full temporary custody for me with supervised visits for Christopher until we could have a full hearing. We also filed a temporary restraining order to prevent Victoria from having contact with Noah while everything was being resolved. Things started moving very fast after that. The law firm where Christopher and Victoria worked found out about the situation. I'm not exactly sure how, but I guess because Eleanor knows some influential people and made some calls. The firm launched its own internal investigation because turns out they have very strict policies about relationships between colleagues, especially when there are hierarchy differences, and Christopher was a senior partner while Victoria was a more junior associate. An undisclosed relationship between them could be considered a violation of professional ethics, especially if Christopher had used his position to favor her in any way. The temporary custody hearing was like 2 weeks after I left the house. Christopher showed up with his own lawyer, a very expensive one from another firm, and tried to argue that I had kidnapped Noah, that I'd taken him without his permission. But my lawyer presented all the evidence, the emails showing the affair, the trust account statements, and most importantly, a report from a child psychologist who had evaluated Noah that week. The psychologist testified that Noah showed clear signs of parental alienation, that he'd been manipulated to reject his biological mother, and that he needed intensive therapy to reverse the psychological damage that had been done to him. The judge heard all the evidence and granted temporary primary custody to me, with limited and supervised visits for Christopher, and specifically ordered that Victoria have no contact whatsoever with Noah until further notice. Christopher was devastated by the decision, but honestly, I felt no sympathy for him. He had created this situation. He had destroyed our family. He had manipulated our son, and now he was facing the consequences. The law firm's investigation continued, and turns out they found much more than they initially expected. Christopher had been giving Victoria favorable case assignments, had recommended her promotion to partner when she didn't have the necessary experience, and basically had used his position to boost her career while they were having their affair. This wasn't just unethical, but it violated multiple firm policies. The firm put both of them on administrative leave while they completed the investigation, which means they couldn't work or receive their full salary. Christopher tried to fight this, but the firm had documentation of everything, including testimony from other lawyers who had noticed the preferential treatment and had complained to HR, but their complaints had been ignored. Meanwhile, Noah started going to therapy 3 times a week with a child psychologist specialized in parental alienation. The first weeks were incredibly difficult. Noah resisted going. He still blamed me for taking him out of the house. He still asked for Victoria and said she was nicer than me, that she cooked better, that she played more with him. The therapist explained to me that this was normal in alienation cases, that Christopher and Victoria had probably been talking badly about me to Noah for months, telling him things like I didn't really love him because I worked so much, that I was selfish, that Victoria would be a better mom. It broke my heart to think my son had been hearing these things about me while I worked double shifts to support our family, while I sacrificed myself to give him a good life. But the therapist also assured me that with time and consistent therapy, Noah could recover, that children are resilient, and that eventually he would understand the truth. About a month after living with Eleanor and Noah being in therapy, the trust investigation was completed. The bank determined that Christopher had violated the trust terms by using the funds to buy property with Victoria, and that he'd also used confidential trust information to apply for loans using the trust's value as collateral without Eleanor's authorization. This last part was particularly serious because it meant he'd compromised the funds that were intended for Noah's education. The bank permanently removed Christopher's access to the trust and began the process of recovering the money that had been misused, which meant they'd probably have to sell the property Christopher and Victoria had bought. At the law firm, The investigation finally concluded, and the results were devastating for Christopher and Victoria. The firm found that they'd not only violated workplace relationship policies, but that Christopher had used confidential client information to help Victoria with her own business ventures on the side. Apparently, Victoria was trying to start her own consulting practice, and Christopher had given her access to client information he shouldn't have shared. This was a massive violation of attorney-client confidentiality and potentially illegal. The firm fired them both immediately and reported the situation to the State Bar Association, which meant they both could face disciplinary proceedings that could result in losing their licenses to practice law. Christopher tried to call me after being fired, left voicemails crying, saying his life was ruined, that he'd lost everything, that he needed to talk to me. But I didn't return the calls. All communication continued to be through our lawyers. Eleanor told me Christopher had tried to call her too, asking her to withdraw the trust complaint, promising to return the money. But she stood firm. She told me she loved her son, but what he'd done was wrong and he had to face the consequences, especially because he'd hurt his grandson in the process. Victoria eventually moved out of our house. Apparently, the story about her flooded apartment had been a lie from the beginning, an excuse she and Christopher had invented to justify her living with him. The truth was she'd ended her apartment lease with plans to move in permanently with Christopher and form a new family with him and Noah. When everything fell apart, she had to find a new place hastily, and was also facing the fact that her career as a lawyer had probably ended before it really took off. Noah slowly, very slowly, started improving in therapy. Like 2 months in, he finally called me Mommy again, without me asking, without me correcting him. He just said it naturally when I picked him up from school one day. He said, "Hi, Mommy. How was your day?" And I almost started crying right there in the school parking lot. His therapist said this was a major breakthrough, that it meant Noah was starting to reconnect with me, that the alienation was reversing. He still had difficult days where he asked about Victoria or where he seemed confused about why we no longer lived with Christopher, but overall he was making progress. The divorce process continued moving forward, and my lawyer was confident we'd get permanent primary custody, that Christopher would probably only have supervised visits until Noah was older and could decide for himself if he wanted to spend more time with his father. The division of assets was complicated because Christopher had spent so much of the trust money that he was technically in debt to the trust, which meant he'd have to sell many of his assets to pay. Our house would probably have to be sold and split the proceeds, but my lawyer was fighting for me to receive a larger portion given the circumstances. The Bar Association disciplinary process against Christopher and Victoria is still ongoing. It could take months, maybe more than a year, but the reality is both of them will probably lose their licenses to practice law, at least temporarily if not permanently. Christopher has been trying to find work, but it's difficult when your reputation in the legal world is destroyed, and everyone knows what you did. Victoria apparently moved to another state, trying to start over away from the scandal, but the truth is these things follow you. The legal community is smaller than people think. Eleanor has been my rock through all of this. She's supported me emotionally and financially while I navigate the divorce and focus on helping Noah heal. She's embarrassed by what her son did, but she's also determined to help us move forward. A few weeks ago, she told me she was thinking about helping me with the down payment on a new house in a better school district for Noah, that she wanted to make sure her grandson had stability and a good environment to grow up in. I don't know if I can accept that level of help, but the fact that she's offering it means the world to me. Last night, Noah and I were sitting on Eleanor's couch watching a movie, just the two of us, and he snuggled against me and told me, "I love you, Mom." Not Mommy, which is what he's always called me, but Mom. Like he was suddenly a little older, a little more aware of everything that's contexting. I told him I loved him too, more than anything in the world. And we stayed like that for the rest of the movie. And right there, I realized we're going to be okay, that this is going to take time. But eventually, we'll heal and build a new life. Just the two of us. Without lies, without betrayals, without people trying to manipulate him and pull him away from me. I don't know exactly what the future will look like. There are still many legal things to resolve, but at least now I know my son has me again and I have him, and that's enough to start.